And that's what he tells Claudius Lysias. Is this the way you treat a Roman citizen? Uncondemned? In other words, you didn't go through the legal processes? Understand, this is what Paul is doing. And then he's going to do it one more time over in Acts 25. He is going to say, I appeal to Caesar. Right? I appeal to Caesar. So from Acts 25 to 28, he waits, he gets taken to Rome, and then he's going to have his trial there. But it's a lengthy process. But during that time, Paul never lets the grass grow under his feet. Even when he gets to Rome, he's going to be preaching. He's going to be strengthening the church there in Rome, even as he waits for his trial. So what we see here is the Roman citizenship all of a sudden puts a halt to the potential abuse. So notice in verse 28, their citizenship is different. Claudius Lysias says, I bought mine, took a lot of money, great sum to be able to buy that Roman citizenship. Paul says, but I was born a citizen. So somewhere in Paul's family, they were Jewish, because he had said, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. Remember over in Philippians 3? He talks about his heritage. So somewhere in that line, he goes, and I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. In other words, both lines, my mom and my dad. It comes down to Saul of Tarsus, or the Apostle Paul. So what we see is, he said, but I was born this way. So somewhere back in Paul's family, someone had done something or had become a citizen, and now Paul received or inherited that citizenship through that. Look at verse 29. Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him. There are some situations you just don't want to be a part of. I mean, anybody ever experienced at least a measure of guilt by association? Okay? Does somebody, well, you were there. And I can remember Mom and Dad saying, you were there. And I'm like, but I didn't do it. And they said, well, you shouldn't have been with those folks. And guess what? I had nothing I could say at that moment. Nothing. It was my choice to be in the wrong place with the wrong people at the wrong time. And I was responsible for my choices. And the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. In other words, the commander had already gone too far without giving due process, without giving him a legal trial. And so now all of a sudden it's not completely hands-off. They don't just release Paul, because what might happen if they put him back on the streets of Jerusalem? They're going to grab him, take him outside the city, and probably try to kill him, as had been done to Stephen earlier. Verse 30. The next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. Now this is a good situation for Paul. Now he gets to appear before the Sanhedrin. And years before, when he had gotten papers to go to Damascus, guess where he got the papers from? The Sanhedrin, the council. Paul was known to many of these individuals. And why we don't get more of the inner, I would love to have been a fly on the wall. And to have, as the Sanhedrin enters there, somebody walks over next to Paul and said, I would have never imagined that you would have done this. You're a turncoat. You've committed treason. You were working with us. How did this happen? Just like what Paul said there in Acts 22. He had been convicted when he knew that Jesus was really the Son of God. And knowing that, it changed everything. And Saul's conversion was real. Saul's conversion was dramatic. Saul's conversion was so powerful as an evidence for the truth of Christianity. Notice now, though, in chapter 23 of Acts, he gets to appear before the Sanhedrin and give a defense. So here, listen to what Paul has to say. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Time out. Paul, you're saying that you lived in good conscience when you were persecuting, casting your vote against Christians? How? A clear conscience, I thought that meant that you were clear. The conscience is only as good as it's trained. Yes, God put inside of you a moral compass. But that compass receives direction from instruction. And so if it's been taught, if it's been trained to think a certain way, then that's how the conscience decides. For instance, let's do a little test. All right? How many of y'all, your parents let you grow up, and when you came into the house, you could, you kept your shoes on, you immediately took your muddy shoes, went over to the couch, and started jumping on the couch? Okay? How many of y'all, not only did you just jump on the furniture, but how many of y'all were able to just throw the ball in the house? Okay? All right? You just, you started playing baseball, football, running all over, knocking over lamps, knocking pictures off the wall. Nobody? I wasn't either. All right? Now here's the thing. All right? So I happen to know that there are some families who take their shoes off at the door. Okay? Now, if you've been trained that way, guess what? You all of a sudden come in somebody else's house. Guess what you start doing? You start taking off your shoes at the door. All right? I mean, sometimes we'll tell the grandkids, you don't have to take your shoes off here. But then we bite our tongue because we realize, wait a minute, the parents, I'm not against what the parents are trying to do. And so if they need to do it at other people's homes also, that's okay. The conscience has been taught in certain things. Is wearing your shoes, taking off your shoes, is that an absolute right or wrong? Does God hold you accountable? Okay. I'm hoping not. Okay. So what we're saying is that the conscience, Paul says, when I was persecuting Christians, I sincerely believed that was the right thing to do. But was it? No. Paul, you were wrong. By the time we get over to 1 Timothy 1 and verse 15, he says, I was insolent. I was a blasphemer. I was, all these things. He says, I am a chief of sinners. I'm the worst of the sinners. So 1 Timothy 1:15, I'm the worst of sinners. Acts 23 and verse 1, I've lived in all good conscience. Do you understand how to reconcile these now? All right? Because he's saying the conscience was trained. It had been taught inaccurately. Paul didn't say my conscience was right. He says I've lived in all good conscience. In other words, I believed I was doing right and I did it with all my heart. When I learned that was wrong, guess what? I stopped doing it. I stopped. When we learn something is wrong, we need to be willing to stop. If you say, well, I've done it this long, at age 50, 60, 70, I'm just not going to be able to change now. I am who I am. No. If you are a child of God, and if you want more than anything else to please God, you can change your sinful ways. You can set aside your selfishness. You can set aside. Paul had a tremendous pride in being a Jew. Read that part in Philippians 3 when he starts going through his pedigree. And then he says there in verse 8, he goes, but I count all things for loss. It was all rubbish. I threw it out at the dump. It was good for the dunghill. That's what it was. No matter what you think about your past, no matter what you've done, no matter where you want credit for what you've done, folks, the only thing that matters is serving and loving the Lord God. Everything else, it doesn't matter about any kind of a family pedigree. That's worthless when it comes to being right with God. The only thing that matters is, where is your trust and obedience for what God has said? So look at what he says here, verse 2 of Acts 23. The high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? Those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confessed both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, "We find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." Now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." If you look at this, I mean, it's almost comical from the standpoint that they're all against Paul, all right, until what? Now the high priest, sometimes, people say, well, you just said that the same Sanhedrin, the council, had given Saul of Tarsus the papers to go to Damascus. So in chapter 9, Paul, had to know who the high priest was. Yes. But do you remember that even in the time of Christ, Annas was the high priest during Jesus' day, but there were at least 6 different members of Annas' family. The high priesthood was a lifetime position. But the Romans didn't want that much concentration of power, so they had moved it, and at the time that Jesus is on trial, it's Caiaphas. And Caiaphas is Annas' son-in-law, right? So he's not the high priest according to the law, but the Romans had removed because they didn't want that concentration of only one. But now it had to be in that family, all right? The descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. And so the Aaronic priesthood had to come through that line. So again, the fact that it was Annas or Caiaphas, the fact that now it's Ananias. At this point, Paul's been away from Jerusalem for many years. He's had 3 missionary journeys, and now he's come back. And again, that's a span of a number of years, possibly almost 20 years at least. So when we look at this, the fact that Paul doesn't know who the high priest is just tells us that Paul's human. Paul just didn't know who was serving in that capacity at that particular time. The Romans had moved it around enough within that family that it kept changing. Notice that Paul perceived that there were Sadducees and Pharisees. That had been the case for a long time. It was not uniform. The council had not been all Sadducees or Pharisees back during Jesus' day, so this was something that, was known. But all of a sudden, Paul has an opportunity. He said, "I'm being called and questioned for the resurrection." Well, that's true. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of the Christian faith. So anyone who's trying to oppose Christianity is, by default, opposing the resurrection. So when Paul brings this up, it's something that is logical. It's something that is clearly going to be divisive among the council. So when he puts this issue on the stand, as opposed to himself, all of a sudden they're fighting with each other. All right? I mean, in one sense, if Paul was a barrister, Melissa, he's brilliant. All right? He uses this, and it blows up the whole trial for him being called into question. Claudius Lysias just wants to know, okay, this is something about the Jewish customs, the law, traditions. What is it? Well, when this happens over the resurrection, Claudius Lysias is like, get him out of here. Go save his life before they pull him apart. Okay? Understand the situation was not helpful from the standpoint of the Roman determining what was going on. But it displayed for everyone the fact that the council was divided over a number of issues. They did not have a uniform faith. They did not have a uniform understanding. In verse 8, talks not only about the resurrection, but even angels or spirits. And again, the Sadducees were very materialistic, which is also why they tended to be very aristocratic and wealthy. And so when you look at this, and again, the Sadducees, even during Jesus' day, there may have been about 500 of them. They were not a large party. Pharisees, on the other hand, was a much larger contingent and a lot more of the average or the working class people, as well as some of the leaders and some wealthy. So he's taken out of there. Verse 12. we're just going to conclude with a couple more verses here. When it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now you, therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. But we are ready to kill him before he comes near." So when Paul's sister's son heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you." Then the commander took him by the hand, went aside, and asked privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" He said, "The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him, but do not yield to them. For more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they would neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." Notice, in this situation, God uses so many different avenues to protect Paul. He told him in verse 11, "You're going to go to Rome." Now there's a conspiracy, an ambush, lying in wait, but it's Paul's nephew who hears about it, is able to tell the commander so that all of this can be prevented. All of this can be made safe to keep Paul alive and allow him to get to Rome. But you have to notice the intensity of the hatred, the prejudice against Paul for the gospel, for the faith of Jesus Christ, for the belief in the resurrection. All of these things working through the hate of the Jews to want to continue to oppose Paul in all of this. Let me stop there. We'll come back and we'll finish chapter 23, Lord willing, next week. Get into chapter 24. But basically what we've got from here is Paul's under arrest, and so it's the process for Paul to get from Jerusalem to Rome, and we're going to go through this and we'll see how this happens. But again, providentially, God is at work. He's protecting Paul and making sure that he can preach the gospel in more places after he goes to Rome. I appreciate your attention, and you've got 15 minutes before we worship together. Thank you.